Awesome, thanks everyone. So yeah, last session of the day, thanks for being here. No drinks haven't started yet. If somehow you can get access to that, that might make my rambling a bit more bearable. So what are we actually going to be talking about? And this is really going to be focused on what the experience is like building for Vision Pro and using it as a development tool. It's not going to be spending a lot of time going into specific APIs. There's fantastic WWDC sessions that go really deep into the code, and they can do a far better job than I'm going to be able to do in the next 30 minutes. So a little bit of context about myself. I'm an iOS developer. I'm with Mantle Group, formerly Itty Bitty Apps. It all got bought up and it's all under the Mantle Group umbrella now. And we've had access to the headsets for a couple of months. We managed to get a couple of grey market imports in fairly early on. And I've been doing some work. We've been porting an existing app. I've been playing around with some brand new stuff a little bit. And primarily we've just been taking it around and getting different clients, lots of different first impressions. I think me and the other person I've been working with, we reckon we've probably shown well over 100 people now. So what is it like to work with as a general purpose computer? And it's pretty good. I would say if the kind of work you're doing can be done on an iPad, it's even better in the Vision Pro. You've got access to bigger and more windows. You finally have access to completely free-form windowing. But the only thing that really struggles compared to an iPad or a traditional computer is text entry is kind of terrible. If you've ever used your TV remote to put in your Wi-Fi password, it's somehow worse than that. It's impressive. Thankfully, the keyboard pass-through works fairly seamlessly. The stuff that got added to iPadOS and macOS a year or two ago works in visionOS, and it works really well. So, of things that require a lot of text entry, what's it like to use the headset as a developer? And since visionOS is based on iOS, you're not going to be doing your main development work inside visionOS directly. Instead, you're going to be using something that the iPad sorely needs, which is Mac pass-through mode. You creates a local network connection to a Mac that's near you, and you get a 4K monitor that streams into the headset. The usual environment that I've found working is to have your Mac as your main display in the center, and then having all your auxiliary things running in Windows floating around it. So things like your music, calendars, email, Slack, or God forbid, Teams. And it all works really well. Keyboard and trackpad gets passed through directly, swapping between your Mac and your visionOS windows, just depending on which one's focused, gets the keyboard. And I've seen no weird issues. Latency is really good, particularly from the context of text editing. And I guess that kind of leads into the big question. Am I working in this day to day? Would I replace my usual setup with a Vision Pro? And no, I wouldn't. It's good. It's really good. But like, fortunately at home, I'm fortunate enough that I've got a studio display, I've got a desk, I've got multiple monitors around me, and it's not as good as that. The resolution is totally usable for text editing and for reading text, but it's not as good as Retina, and the device is really heavy. I think it's not as bad as some reviewers are making it out. I think they ham it up a bit. But I also wouldn't want to spend 8-10 hours inside the headset for a time. I think 1 to 2 hours is probably about where you're going to cap out before you're going to want a break. There is one area though where I absolutely do and would use a Vision Pro as the main display, and that is to actually make visionOS apps. So like a regular development environment, you would just have your Mac pass through running your main text editor, in this case Xcode, and you just hit build and run, and the visionOS window just pops up in front of you wherever you're looking. In fact, that's actually one really annoying criticism. Wherever you're looking is where the window spawns in, so you take it, you place it off to the side, you look at Xcode, you build and run. It takes about 20-30 seconds to actually start running, and then inevitably spawns in front of you because you weren't looking off to the side randomly. Please, if there's one request for visionOS 2, just leave the window where I placed it. For the slow build and run cycle, there is a solution, and it's of course give Apple more money. You can buy a developer strap for it that allows you to have a wired connection. We've not had access to one of these. You need a US developer account to even purchase one. From testing I've seen, it takes the build and run time down to about 6 seconds. I'm getting thumbs up from the audience. I would say if you're doing this day to day, you're going to want the developer strap. Wireless debugging works, but adding that 15 seconds onto every build and run really gets tiring. So why are you going to bother doing this? I just said I wouldn't use this as a main development environment, so why am I building visionOS apps inside it? And it's for a couple of reasons. This is a platform that is most unlike a simulator, and there's a few main reasons where it sticks out and why you're going to want physical hardware access. The first is just that scale is really hard to judge. Now, obviously building and testing UI on device is a part of good app development in general, but you've been able to get a decent sense of scale in a simulator, and it's more for fine-tuning and making things look right. But you can see here, I've got the Mac window scaled to be exactly the size of a 27-inch monitor in front of me. And then you've got the simulator, which then has a smaller window inside it. And it's just not even close to the size of what these windows are in front of you. These are gigantic, potentially meter across sheets of glass floating in front of you. And you just don't get a sense of how big UI elements are, how big text is. Things will end up far too big, far too small, and nothing's going to look quite right. The next is that eye tracking. The eye tracking's really good, and I've found myself preferring the eye tracking over using a trackpad, even when I've already got it connected through my Mac. But it's one of those things that it takes a lot of effort to make it feel like it's no effort and feel like it has that magical, it just works. You need to be really careful with how close you place UI elements together for the eye tracking to be able to tell what's going on. I don't know how well it's coming across in the screen recording, but these two sliders there on top of each other, you can't tell, visionOS can get really confused for which one you're trying to interact with. And in a simulator, it works fine. Try and do it through the eye tracking and it just kind of wigs out occasionally. And it's these kinds of things that aren't really obvious when you're using it in a simulator. And the next is just physical comfort. I mentioned it previously, these windows are massive and potentially meters across. And because of the way human eyes work, it's easier for us to scan left and right, up and down, left to right and downwards. It actually takes way more eye muscles to look up or look diagonally. And if you're asking the user to constantly look up to interact with UI elements, it ends up being a kind of tiring experience. And there are dozens of tiny little details like that, but this is a platform where you are far more immersed into the UI and it's far bigger, and little details become much more important. A lot of them become a lot less obvious until you're actually running with the giant window floating in front of you. So how do we actually build them? What are our options as developers to take our existing apps and put them in visionOS? The first is compatibility mode, and this is it's an okay experience. It's little to no work on your part. In fact, visionOS launched with 1 million apps on day one, and they get to that number by opting everyone into compatibility mode unless you then go in and turn it off. And it's a decent experience. Apps don't look and feel quite right. They feel a little out of place. Depending on how close you've placed UI elements together, the eye tracking can get quite confused sometimes. The more system UI you're using in your app, the better the experience is likely going to be, or the better you're supporting accessibility APIs. If you're doing that right, can make things work a bit nicer. And it's going to be what most apps are for a long time. This isn't going to be a mass market device for quite a number of years, and it's not going to make sense for people to go in and put that effort in to create native visionOS versions. In saying that, we're all here, we're at an iOS developer conference, we probably care about nice experiences, so there is native visionOS apps, and there's a little bit of passion, there's a little bit of panache here. It doesn't quite make sense commercially yet, but these are a much better experience. One thing you'll notice about all of them is they tend to have this frosted glass effect, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But this makes them feel much more integrated into the environment. There's also a couple of other things that get added. You can add this to an existing app, either by adding it as a new run destination if you've got a multi-platform app, or it can either just be a new target. Either way, it's going to be a new binary that gets created with its own separate App Store entry, and those are going to be managed separately. But it's a much better experience if you can somehow justify the effort. So we spent a little bit of time doing that effort. It was just a little bit of a proof of concept. We took one of our clients who had a smallish app that was recently created. It was entirely Swift UI, not a ton of screens, and we're quite friendly with them. So we said, hey, we're just going to take your app, get at least a golden path of it going, and that way we could just get a feel for what the porting experience is like. Some of the things we found. Some of your dependencies are just going to kind of break. Particularly if you've got things that are multi-platform dependencies, they'll have things like if iOS or iPadOS or watchOS do a UIKit thing, else do an AppKit thing. That now needs to be if iOS or iPadOS or watchOS or visionOS do the UIKit thing. In our case, it was UI color versus NS color. I can't remember if that's what the name is. Firebase is kind of weird. They have added support for it, but at least when we were doing it, you had to launch it with special environment variables to change how it was building. That might be fixed now. Thankfully, everything we had for this app was all open source, so we could go in, make the handful of changes. At the time, Vexel was actually one of the things that's broken, so Bok wants to maybe fix that. Oh, sick. And at that point, we get the app going. So next thing you're going to notice is big blocks of color look really bad on visionOS. A lot of apps will have solid backgrounds for views, and it looks really bad. visionOS, like I said, has that frosted glass effect for a lot of things with different levels of opacity to separate elements. And what this does is that it allows some of the backgrounds kind of bleed through. It allows things like edge highlights to get caught on everything. And particularly when you're inside the headset, it makes the windows feel much more like physical objects rather than fake screens. And everything about the Vision Pro really is going towards selling that illusion of these being real objects in the real world as opposed to a completely virtual environment. So it's usually a matter of going through, changing your backgrounds, making sure you're using these materials. You really want to avoid and limit the amount of color you're using at all. Again, these windows are massive. It's hard, and unless you've had to play with it, it's hard to kind of get just how big things are inside the headset. And if you've got massive blocks of color, that can be almost eye-searing in a lot of cases. You want to use color very, very subtly and very just for little highlights on things. Thankfully, again, you can just conditionally compile this out, doing this like if visionOS, do a thin material, else do a black or a white, whatever you like. The next is making sure that everything you are running has the hover effects correctly applied. What visionOS does is that when you're looking at an element that's meant to be interactive, it applies a highlight on top of it so the user gets some feedback. And without these, your app will feel really broken. I think it's almost akin to if you've ever used a MacBook while it's turned off and tried to click the trackpad and it doesn't click because the fake haptic stuff's not working and just kind of feels a little bit wrong and broken. It's similar to that. In a lot of cases, this is largely just a case of setting shapes for your buttons if you're using custom buttons. As you can see up the top there is a button that's just using a text input. That gets for free. There's nothing you need to do there. If you're using one where you're passing in a custom view, you just need to define the shape of the button in a modifier and give it a plain style. And if for some reason you have to use a fake button, which if you can, don't, you should be using button and UI button, but if you do for some reason, you can manually tell the system, hey, apply a hover effect to this. One note with this is that you don't, as a developer, get access to when the hover effect is being applied. For privacy reasons, the system will not tell you exactly what the user is looking at any point. Instead, you need to just declare that this is the regular state, this is the hover state, and the operating system will only tell you when something's actually selected. Just some little picky notes if you're defining custom shapes because you've got a custom view for your button. That's the formula for the inner and outer corner radius, and just make sure you're setting the same radius type between the between the two shapes. The continuous and circular are ever so slightly different, and if you've got them stacked right on top of each other, it can look a little bit funky. The final problem we kind of found that was common across a lot of screens is that resizing. visionOS allows freely resizable windows by default, and particularly if it's just an iPhone app, things get really broken when you start to freely resize them. And unfortunately, like the other two, there's no just, hey, use this API, you use this material. It's as much or more a design issue as it is a development issue, and it's just a lot of work. The only general advice I can say is don't be afraid of Windows. This is a platform that has freeform windowing. There's nothing wrong with just popping out lots and lots of things into separate windows and letting the user place them wherever they want, so you don't end up with incredibly dense single window experiences. There's no reason to not have a ton of windows around. So, like I mentioned, the Vision Pro is not going to be a commercial success for years at best. It's just far too expensive for that. So what are some things you can kind of be doing now that are going to help you prepare if visionOS does take off and you do eventually want to do a port or a new app? And if not, just generally good so you're not wasting your time. I would say modularization is always a good thing. We found that you ended up with doing a lot of, if you're porting an existing app and just adding a new run destination, you do a lot of, if visionOS do this, else do this, and that kind of ends up sprinkled across everything. Particularly if it's an iPhone app first, you're probably going to want to seriously reconsider how you do navigation and screen structure in your app to kind of take account for it just being a lot bigger of a canvas to work on. I would probably tend towards having a separate app target, and then what you can do is have all your code split out into separate modules, and then you can kind of just like piece together things from the modules in the two app targets is the way I would go about it. The more platform standard UI you're using, the better. Things like tab controllers, navigation controllers, using the buttons will just automatically adapt to themselves. A tab bar will just automatically pop out into being that nice ornament off to the side, and we'll get all the animations and stuff nicely applied to it. Again, things like search controllers, navigation controllers, all of that you'll get a lot more for free. And Swift UI tends to be a lot easier. Technically, UIKit is supported on visionOS, but I think from the way Apple's talking about it, from the way a lot of the APIs are, it's clear that Swift UI is the primary UI framework for this platform. So the more of your app that's in Swift UI, the easier you're going to find it. So that's pretty much it. That's a bit of shameless self-promotion. That's my Mastodon if you want to check me out. And there is going to be a more wordy version of this slide deck posted on the Mantle Group blog, in probably a week or two. So with that, any questions?
Thank you, James. Cool. Yeah, any questions? questions? Yes.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. Really appreciate the perspective on visionOS.
I guess one question I had was, what kind of apps do you feel might lend itself well to the way visionOS works?
I think right now, anything where there's a big 3D component, so it's going to be entertainment games, make a lot of sense. They're the most flashy and impressive ones. Anything with 3D content, so that's going to be if you've got 3D models, if you're a product app and you've got, say you're IKEA and you've got 3D models of all your things, that's going to make a lot of sense. Otherwise, I don't think it's going to make a ton of sense to bring an app to visionOS until there's that critical mass where it kind of gets expected as a platform, i.e. like people expect there to be an iPad version of your app. If visionOS really takes off, they may expect there to be a native visionOS version as well. But yeah, unless you've kind of got that entertainment or lots of 3D content, it's probably not going to make sense for a little while.
What about like training? Would be good for interactive
Yeah.
training and industry. See some of the blogs that come out. Jigspace.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. Jigspace is probably one of the better. Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly anything where the environment you're going into is either it's hazardous to take people into, or you're dealing with equipment that is expensive or dangerous to work on. I know Intel's done some work with VR, AR training for all their lithography machines, which are just way too expensive to ever take offline. Yeah, that's going to make a lot of sense there.
What would you like to see happen with kind of the visionOS 2?
So my selfish one is to, when you respawn a window that's already running, leave it where it is. Otherwise, I think loosening up some of the restrictions around what data you have access to as a developer. Things like it's got all these cameras and sensors all over the front of it, but you get no access to any of that. You don't get any gaze detection, which I get from a privacy perspective. There's some real creepy stuff you could do with that, but even if you have to throw up big scary warnings being like, this app is about to see exactly where you're looking, are you sure you're okay with that? I think lifting some of those restrictions, I think.
You talked a bit about the visual style of visionOS, the first class. Are we worried at all about like legibility, accessibility of basically white text that is on effectively a mid-grey background? I'm not hearing a lot of people talk about that.
So there's obviously the usual host of accessibility features where you can go in and bump up contrast, bump up text size. I've found from at least myself and kind of other people, no one seems to have any major issues with legibility. If you're just using all the standard platform things like the materials and just like the foreground styles, they do a fairly good job of adapting to each other to make sure text stays legible. Yeah, I've not seen any concerns so far.
Cool. Well, thank you again. Brilliant stuff.
Awesome. Thanks.